Welcome to Voices in the Dark. Today as our guest we have Dr. John Waterlow, author, academic, podcaster.
Today I am the guest.
Today
I have a title.
Yes.
Thank you for the warm welcome to the studio. And it is very warm in the studio.
It is very warm, very toasty, especially after all the toiling we did to set it all up. Anyway, but welcome to the show as a guest. And we want to talk about the book, about the labor of love and hate that has taken you 10 years.
Yeah, I was working it out. The project began as a PhD back in 2008, and it is now 2018. So that's quite a lump of time and quite a chunk of my soul along the way too.
Hopefully, so in essence, this book is your Horcrux.
This book is my Horcrux. For those not watching on video, you can come see it with a beautiful cover. It's called It's Only a Joke, Comrade, Humour, Trust and Everyday Life Under Stalin. Yes. It's got a picture of Stalin with a tomato thrown at his face. And if you look very carefully, you will discover there's an in-joke on the title, but I'm not on the cover, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. So
it's a good thing you came out with the second part of the sentence quickly. I was about to spoil it by saying it out loud.
So if you can rumble what the in-joke is, I may well send you a copy of the book. But okay. We'll talk about a way to win the book later in the episode.
Towards the end. We'll hide it randomly, so you have to listen to the whole thing.
Yeah. This is a manipulation game.
So let's start from the beginning. This is a very, very interesting thing to look at, but how did you become interested in it? How did you get to the point where, like, I'm going to write a book about this?
A book about humour under a dictatorship, a book about humour under one of the most violent and repressive regimes in modern history. In a way, you would think, well, that's really not something that's going to be funny at all. There's not usually that association. However, we kind of forget that funny and serious are not opposites, that funny things can be serious and serious things can be funny, and we find that in all aspects of our lives, but we kind of often don't join the dots between them. And I came to want to use humour with regard to this regime because ever since high school, really, when my teacher and I started reading about it, this period of revolution in Russia where they overthrow the old order and they set about trying to create this ideal utopian world, which is full of really exciting and quite compelling ideas of equality and opportunity for everybody, of respect for people regardless of their backgrounds, the possibility of, I mean, it's almost like a warped mirror of the American dream, and it's not about accumulating wealth, but it is about having every possibility in front of you and working for the common good rather than thinking that it's all about you as an individual. And plenty of very positive psychological positions or philosophical positions would say, well, that sounds really healthy, actually. So that's the promise. And then when we get about 10 years after the revolution of 1917 has happened, they think, okay, so we've consolidated power to some extent. We've managed to stave off the incursions of civil war and foreign powers trying to destabilize this revolution. And Stalin ends up more or less on the top of the heap by about 1928 as the leader. And he says, okay, so now we need to seriously modernize and industrialize this country. I think the only parallel I could see would be the modernization of Japan, which takes about 40 years, looking into outside examples and bringing in foreign experts, and they transform their society and culture over a period of about 40 years to the point where they can then happily sink the Russian Navy in 1905, which is, they send the Navy from like 2 different parts of the world and they come around and sink them, yeah. And then the other one makes it all the way around, the long way around, and it's sunk by the Japanese. So given that's like Russia's in that sort of state, being sunk by the Japanese in 1905, a few years later, Stalin was like, okay, I want this kind of modernization, but I want it in a quarter of the time. Because otherwise our revolution and this country and these ideals are going to be gone, destroyed, because the capitalist West is going to want to destroy this revolution in its infancy.
I would also assume that someone with that level of I need to be in control of everything would realize that if it takes 40 years, he won't be there to see it and complete it, and whoever comes next will most likely screw it up. I think that would be playing in their mind
Yeah, I mean, Stalin and Steve Jobs have probably got a lot in common in that respect. So yeah, he wants to see it happen. He wants to see it happen now. And what fascinated me from the high school classroom onwards is this rapid attempt to change society and change the people in it. They don't just want to heavily industrialize. They don't just want to urbanize like crazy. They don't just want to change the entire economic structure so that things are centrally planned. They also want to create a new Soviet person. Sometimes it's kind of mistranslated, I think, as new Soviet man. The word is more neutral. New Soviet person who's going to embody the values of communism in word and deed and even in identity. And so for the 1930s, up until the outbreak of the Second World War, there's this attempt not only to transform things in a practical way, but in the personal way, to educate what is largely a peasant, illiterate population and create the kind of people that the Bolsheviks want to see in the world. And what fascinated me is, well, how the hell do you do that? How do people respond to that? This sort of a personal revolution right down to your personality and personhood. That is huge. How do people make sense of it where they're being told, okay, everything that was valuable to you in your life before, every system of understanding that you had before is going to be torn up, and now you need to be something else. Your whole life has changed. Maybe you just moved to the city and you've never been to a city before, and it's a building site, and you're being told you need to be a different person, you better attend classes and go to the theater and be cultured and everything else. How does anyone make sense of that stuff? And for a long time, it seemed as though the only interpretations available as to how people could make sense of it and endure the enormous psychological pressures of direct force, repression, Stalin's Great Terror, which happens towards the end of the decade. The only interpretations that floated around for a long time, I won't say only, but like the principal ones, were people were forced against their will and were living in fear and terror, hence the term terror. You had to do what you were told, or you were rounded up, and your family were, and you would be killed or sent to a concentration camp, the Gulag. Or people were duped, that they believed in Big Brother, that Orwell idea, that, okay, well, the system is kind of screwy, our lives are really difficult, but I think Stalin's okay. And his cult of personality, which is everywhere. It's all Stalin this, Stalin that, every positive thing that happens, you give thanks to Stalin. His face is on posters everywhere. He's only spoken about in the terms of like highest adoration. So did people essentially then think, okay, I believe in this guy. He seems like a nice replacement for the Tsar or for God. So let's go with that. And I found neither of those things very convincing. And I'm not the only one here. Plenty of people, historians and analysts, have thought, okay, there's got to be something else. But there was essentially a move towards saying it's more complicated than that, but people spoke about grey zones, about the space between affirmation and dissent, and said, well, it's complicated. So, well, that's true. But how is it complicated? Mm-hmm. Like, how are people making sense of their lives through all of this? Some people would talk about, oh, well, maybe it's passive resistance, and we'll get into that question later quite a lot. Maybe, maybe they're just sort of trying to get on with their lives, and they like Stalin a bit. So, okay, could we try and get a bit deeper into this? And so, this is the longest question conceivable, or longest answer to your question conceivable, but it's just when people say, well, so like summarize your book in a few sentences, yes. And I'm like, well, if I could, I wouldn't have written a book. I would have just made a statement, put out a tweet. So when I first, let me tell you a story then this way. When I was first reading some of these books which started looking at everyday life instead of just talking about grand politics and the top leaders, they would throw in some jokes, some contemporary jokes critical of the regime as kind of a little bit of creative seasoning, like you'd season a nice dish. And I was like, wait, this is paradoxical. This is kind of like surreal, because it seemed completely obvious to me, or that of course people would be making jokes about their lives, because humor is a human universal, and in hard times, humor is a crucial part of how we deal with and make sense of things. And yet that clashed so completely with the story that I'd been told up to that point of people are either terrified, or some of them are staunch resistors who will likely be eliminated by the regime. I thought, well, this joke doesn't seem like staunch resistance to me. And it doesn't sound like people are completely terrified or brainwashed into loving Big Brother. What's going on here? And that book and most of them will just go, okay, on to the next thing. Repression, terror, blood.
Okay.
So wait, I like jokes. I like jokes. I think something very strange is happening here, and I think we're missing a lot of the picture if we only look at these contemporary moments of humor as just a little dash of, oh, here's a funny episode, and now let me get back to, talking about mass arrests and Gulag imprisonment. So I thought this was something that I would try and pursue as a way to color in that gray zone, because humor doesn't really deal in black and whites. Humor is ambivalent in its very nature. It takes some things that we're familiar with and kind of turns them on their head and shows you a different version, puts things in a different light. It's incredibly social, and this is meant to be a society that was atomized through fear of mutual denunciation, fear of the secret police. So people are telling jokes to each other, so who can they trust to tell? And humor is, I think it works like myths. And mythologists and philosophers say a myth is an image through which we try to make sense of the world. They're the stories we tell ourselves that give, from a broader picture, some sense and meaning to our lives. And I think of jokes as like they're more playful siblings, where they don't just explain, they kind of, they cause you to look at things in a different light. They give you a different story than the one that you might have expected. They play with your expectations. They challenge, they poke, they play, but they don't come to outright, and this is the way that things are forever. It's challenging and questioning instead of trying to just hide under the covers of the accepted version of events.
Would you say that jokes play with the boundary between reality and exaggeration in a way that helps us then find the edge of our reality?
Yeah, because they're dancing along the boundary of acceptability, the boundary of what's expected and what's normal. And partly by, okay, so if they're joking about this and they're finding it funny, and that's meant to be dangerous, then that tells us something about where the danger zone lies. So they can highlight some of those areas and those boundaries, but they come very much from places of friction. Emotional friction and psychological friction, where you're kind of grating up against expectations of the way things are meant to be and the way that you're actually experiencing them. And one of the main sort of theories of humor, which is just accounts for one part really, is we find things funny when they are incongruous. And that would take a long time to go into, but in the broadest way, when our expectations are kind of upset, like I didn't see that punchline coming, that's through, I was led to think of one outcome and now you've given me another, now that's pretty funny. Or if our kind of mechanical, unreflective expectations are suddenly upset. Like in the crudest form, it's like someone's walking along, they step on a banana, they've fallen over. Well, that's funny because they were doing a thing that didn't get the outcome they expected and created an unexpected twist in the situation, which for some reason we find funny. Partly that's because of the incongruity of the situation. Now, in Stalin's Soviet Union, there is an abundance of incongruity, because there is a master narrative telling everyone that the promised land has already arrived or is arriving right now. So it's as though the regime hands out a map of, this is the Soviet Union now. And they look at the map and they look up from the map, look around them and go, no, this doesn't work. And it becomes absurd and silly. And that draws humor immensely, but partly that's to resolve the tension between the incongruity.
I find it interesting that they were trying to sell the utopia as it's already arrived, considering people were dying of hunger. It's a hard sell.
It's a hard sell, and it's difficult for us to think our way into the shoes of the people who are living through it. And I think that humor is particularly useful to do that, because if you can think yourself into the mindset of someone to find their jokes funny, then you come several steps closer to understanding their situation. So a lot of the jokes that I encountered, I could find funny because I knew the situation in depth, and then people would ask, "What's your favorite joke from the period?" And I tell them, and they're like, really?
Yeah.
How?
There's a few really harrowing anecdoti,
Anecdoti, the plural, yeah.
that I thought, is this a joke? Like, I can't remember the exact one, but like something like, if we had to do it in English, like, we're all dying of hunger. Like it's like, what? Why is that a joke?
Well, do you want me to tell you why it's a joke?
Sure.
Okay, so one of the key parts of humor in these desperate times, and we see this too in the humor of people in Nazi concentration camps. A lot of people these days are talking about having read Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning, which is a very powerful testament to the human will to survive and endure, even in Auschwitz. And Frankl talks a lot about jokes and humor that are going on at that time. We think, humor in Auschwitz? What is there to laugh about? Well, part of this is the Gallows humor effect, which is laughing at something which is frightening and intimidating and over which you have no direct control, and it's going to affect you directly. So if you can make a joke, like you're literally being led to the gallows, you're going to be executed, and you look up and go, hope it doesn't rain today.
But see, that's funny.
That's
a clear joke.
That's a joke, except it's funny to us maybe more easily because we are at a distance. The reason the person on their way to the gallows is saying that is to create a psychological distance for themselves from the situation that they're going into by taking the frightening, disturbing, terrifying prospect of their own death and putting it into a genre where things aren't even meant to make sense, where you put this absurd light on it, but absurd things don't have to be taken seriously. Therefore, you can laugh. And at least for a moment, a few moments, maybe in the reassuring laughter, if there's people around you who can laugh, we can give ourselves this really potent placebo. It does not change the objective situation that you're in and all of its shittiness, but it does change how you feel internally, and that can make all the difference in the world.
I guess I'm going to answer my own question in a way, but the difference I see between the joke you just made and some of the ones I read in there was that a lot of the time there's a subversion of expectations in a joke. Whereas I found some in here where it seemed like they were saying what everyone knew and expected, and that was the joke. And I'm like, how can that be a joke? But I realized that in my own life, sometimes I've made that with someone treated me really badly, and I knew they would. And I still found it funny because they did meet my expectation. And the joke was that they are as horrible as I think they are, I guess. But it's a bit different from most jokes where there's a turning it upside down. Instead, when it's, you got exactly what you were expecting from the beginning in that one.
Yeah, I mean, the book is, I don't put jokes in the title because it's only a joke, Comrade, but it's humor. And humor, the world of humor is much more than set-piece jokes. Humor can be a pointed silence or a raised eyebrow. Humor can just be a knowing look between two people when you see silly patterns being played out as you expected they would in the way that you were saying. And to be able to laugh at the terrible conditions that you're in can be immensely personally liberating, at least again for a time. This is not about, you tell a joke and everything's cool. No. These are just important moments which can shift how somebody feels going forwards with their lives. So if you're being told, I think one that you like that you mentioned to me the other day is the number of hours in the working day was being increased yet once again. And somebody jokingly said, well, I'm going to vote for an 18 working hour day so that I'll be able to kick the bucket as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
You did like that that one, where Or people can see like a silver lining in something which is terrible. They say, oh, okay, so there's going to be even more rationing. We're going to have to get up, like they had to queue all the time to go and get stocks from shops, and often you would get to the end of the line and there would be nothing left for you, and then you go hungry. So when there's a shift to like an even more stringent regime of rationing, someone goes, well, that's cool, we won't have to stand in queues anymore. It wouldn't be worth doing. And you see an imaginary silver lining out of it, which can give you some solace, because it is to think yourself out of being the victim of the situation. And a lot of it's almost paradoxical, because a lot of the jokes of the time, people are laughing at their own victimhood status.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what you're getting at, because I call it a schadenfreude directed at themselves. Like, I'm laughing at my own suffering. But there is a way in which, by laughing at yourself in the victim position, no longer leaves you in the state of feeling like a helpless victim, because a helpless victim has no control over how they're feeling. This is an important assertion of your ability to take a step back and not just be in the cell of your own victimhood, and be able to express a perspective from which you have a sense of illusory control over that situation. And that's quite difficult to get our heads around, but maybe in our everyday lives we can think of this. When in an ordinary workplace scenario, the boss makes unrealistic demands, or we know that there is, going back to the map that I mentioned earlier, here's the map of how company X is supposed to operate, and you look up from the map and you're like, that's not how things operate at all, and everything's shitty for all of us. And then you can find it funny through the sheer incongruity of the difference between the map and what's going on, how things are. And even if that means your everyday life is nonsense, you can joke about how the manager victimizes you. You can joke about how absurd you think the whole thing is. And when you can put it to the side, or this emotional place where you think it's silly and ridiculous, it makes it harder for it to hurt you. Harder doesn't make it impossible.
No, when you mention it that way, it does bring some sort of almost flashbacks for me of working for Apple in the UK, where there was a beautiful, idealized sort of 5-year plan, or
yes,
a sort of set of rules or values to live by that were beautiful when you written down. The company's credo, the company's sort of set of values started with the first line saying, at Apple, our most important resource, our soul, is our people, meaning the employees. You're like, wow, employee-centric. And then you'd see that it was very rarely kind of followed through, or even co-opted and used in a way against its own people. Like basically telling people that they weren't following the credo, and therefore that's why things were shit. Or things, there's a lot of mirrors, I think, and is probably what happens when you have a set of, this is the way things are going to be, that is very idealized, that then reality just doesn't match up with it. And the only way to cope with it when you're in that, and you're being told that things are wonderful, but they're not, is to joke.
It's maybe the best way to cope, because my mind wants to go in two different directions here at once. Remind me to talk about laughter and tears separately. There's a real core to this book where I wanted to make the case that these people in the past under this regime are not very different from us. And for a long time, because of lack of information, the shadow of knowing that there had been millions of people sent to the Gulag who were worked to death, or many who were executed outright, it seemed as though it would be impossible for us to understand what their life would be like. How could we imagine being in those conditions? So in those extremes, surely they would be experiencing things that would be extremely different from how we make sense of and live our lives and have difficulties. And that's not true. They did have exceptionally strange and extraordinary circumstances to deal with, but the way in which they dealt with them is innately human. This is a human story which has a lot to tell us about how we cope and make sense of and make compromises and accommodations to demands on us that we don't want to. It's the same mechanisms that are at play. So when we can talk about people laughing in the face of outright arrest and repression, it's the same drive to humor, to assert some sense of ourself, to try and point out that authority cannot control your mind, even if it can control your body. It's the same impulses which lead us to, if we're working for Apple, make those jokes in the workplace, to push back in those ways. And it just, I don't know if I'm articulating this clearly enough, because I'm not trying to draw like an equivalence between the experience of people under Stalin and just people working for corporations today. It's not equivalent in terms of the scale and the demands, but the underlying fundamentals, the underlying human and interpersonal dynamics are very familiar. So what I was trying to do in this book is go, look, don't do this silly thing where people talk about, oh, okay, we can't repeat history, we need to learn the lessons of history, so don't get a mustachioed dictator. That is not the lesson of history. The lesson of history from here, if you want, I mean, it's one that you could take, is that under intense repressive conditions, people will accommodate and adapt and find a way to try and forge a life that is meaningful to them. And that's a much more hopeful story. The downside is that in joking about it, they also are finding ways to adapt and accommodate to it.
See, this is where you differ from, I think, the rest of the experts. At least you mentioned this, and I certainly heard other people throughout my life mention that satire and jokes against the powers that be are a form of important response, like a fighting back against the regime or the situation, and that so long as satire is allowed, there is hope that sort of a revolution or sort of an opposite movement will form, and when it's oppressed, then it's a sign that things will forever be sort of shadowed. And you sort of argue that actually, or at least from so far what I read in the book and some of the discussions we've had, that jokes don't help, at least not in that sense of overcoming, in this case, dictatorship.
I tried throughout to resist resistance as the interpretational matrix or prism or something if you wish to see things, because that's been the default, and yet, so it's a very murky topic, because let's lay out the problems at the beginning here. That how do you define resistance? Well, if the government, if the state is saying anything negative and critical about the party and its policies is resistance, then yeah, the jokes are resistance. But then do we want to adopt what a paranoid regime considers to be the parameters for resistance? Probably not. On the other hand, are the people who are telling these jokes or making these criticisms, did they think that they are pushing back and resisting the regime? Many of them might. And I wouldn't want to claim that we could delegitimize their experience of it. What I wanted to know, because I kind of balance these issues up. Many people push back against me trying to say I think there's a different story here. And I thought, okay, well, maybe this is a story where I need to take a step back or take a step to the side and go, okay, so it can feel like resistance to the people who are doing it, and that's important. The state treats it as resistance because that's important, leads to a lot of punishment and so on. But from our perspective, trying to understand what is happening when they share their humor and their criticisms, does it help us get the full picture to talk about it as resistance, as a sort of simple push-pull, or here is the state's version of events and here's my version of events and they're just clashing head-on all the time? And my answer is no. That really doesn't help us understand the complexity of their experience and what's going on. Criticizing rules is not the same as surrendering allegiance to there being rules. Just because I break a certain rule at work doesn't mean that I think there should be no rules in the system at all. And say, it's the kind of extreme jump that we see from, say, only very radical left-wing critics who would claim that being unhappy with certain aspects of capitalism or criticizing like the greed of corporations means that if you do that, you're essentially saying, away with liberal democracy and capitalism entirely. It's a similar junk to say that people telling jokes about the difficulties of life under Stalin are rejecting the regime wholesale and saying, I don't want any part of it.
I found interesting that, so in the first chapter you outline the sort of initial jokes, the early jokes, which seem to make fun of the fact that those at the top are not following the rules, but in a way that suggests that that people at large believe in the rules in the direction of the country and in the socialist revolution. So at the beginning, in fact, the joke is that the assholes at the top are not following the rules.
Yeah.
And then later it becomes more about, are we actually, is this just a big lie? Are things just falling apart?
There's more suspicion of that over time, but I don't think it's just one flips into the other completely. But yeah, there's this desire that things should really work as they're meant to. I feel like the regime was criticized more for its failings than for its promises. Because there's a lot to like in those promises. And people are not at the later stage of like the 70s and 80s in the Soviet Union where there was a greater feeling that like communism was a joke in itself, that wasn't being taken seriously. This is in the midst of enormous industrial activity and modernization that people had never seen before in their lives. It was much easier to get invested in and have a sense of possibility, even if it's not working out very well right now. So I call this kind of mechanism wishing it would work, just a simple way of calling it. That people are joking about the shittiness of the circumstances, but that's because they rather wish that things were the way that they ought to be according to the claim. So one of the most common jokes that I found is, why did Lenin wear shoes but Stalin wears jackboots? Because Lenin knew where he was going. I mean, there's all sorts of variations on that one, or like, because Lenin was just walking down the path and Stalin's already up to his knees in shit, or things like that. Where the criticism, and there's so many jokes like this, where the criticism isn't the destination or where we'd like to be. It's the fact that the current leadership is not getting us there, because things are not matching up with the reality that we wanted it to be. And that's why, in part, even the loyal members of the party, and that's quite a senior status to have at this time, to be a card-holding party member, they're also telling jokes. And many of them are really distressed when they get arrested for it. So looking at not only their criminal files, but the letters that they write asking for their case to be reviewed, they're like, but I'm a communist. Like, I believe in this stuff, and I was talking to other communists. You know, it didn't make me an enemy of the party to do this. Or one particular letter that I have in the book where it causes a lot of deep personal pain to a person who was a young man in this period, and he's writing in the 60s now, trying to have the stain of the conviction removed from his record. He's saying, look, I was a member of the Communist Youth League, the Komsomol, and I told jokes, but the point was I wanted to try and correct some problems, like some failings, some issues. It seemed to him as though that was as reasonable, or maybe even a more gentle way to try and critique the failings that he saw around him. And instead, he was bundled off and arrested, as though it made him a complete enemy of the regime. You know, even these most loyal people are doing this. I think that has to open our eyes to consider, wait, just because you tell a critical joke doesn't mean that you're saying that you think the whole system is completely rotten. And part of this issue of resistance, I think it's partly because this is just my personal take, which isn't in the book, because it sounds a bit too general, but I think that we, especially when the Cold War was still happening, for Western observers, we want there to be resistance. We don't like the idea that this regime, characterized as so terrible and repressive, could also have held a lot of appeal to people. You think, well, okay, they must be either completely brainwashed, the poor people, or they must be opponents, because how could you want to live under such a regime? And that doesn't leave very much space for recognizing that there are all sorts of ways that people could and would have to make sense of it and find meaning in their lives and want to buy into some of these ideals. And so I think it does a great disservice to the people who lived at that time to just stand back and look through these kind of blinkered cultural expectation from that perspective and just be like, well, of course there should be resistors. And there were so many accounts of emigres who left the system, usually, who managed to escape at one point or another, and they also warped the image, because they were people who definitely didn't like the regime at all and had been very persecuted by it, and they had every reason to say it's an appalling regime. But that's not the whole picture either. They were very loud voices, especially if they were like aristocrats who'd fled the revolution in the first place. So because they come over to their aristocrat friends and government officials in other countries that are not happy there's a revolution in Russia, and they're all like, oh, the Bolsheviks are awful. Like, I thought they were awful too. I'm glad you're confirming to me that they're awful. Oh, the people are completely oppressed. They're completely deluded. Oh, thank you. I mean, it's great that you, one person who's lived on a fancy mansion your whole life, can tell me what the opinions are of everyone in the biggest country in the world. It annoys me, as you can tell, that's been the sort of, I think, quite lazy analysis for a long time. Things have changed a lot in historiography. I'm not trying to make a statement claiming that I'm the only one seeing things clearly, by no means. But that was for a long time the picture, until the Cold War ended, really, when it was more possible to begin to go into the archives and look in greater depth at the variety of experience that was happening.
It's quite interesting, the upper classes' reaction usually when there's a shift like that. I think there's some parallels as well with the rejection of the political elite in the last US election, where the political elite is just confused as to why people would rather have Trump destroy their lives than accept yet another sort of aristocrat ruler from a dynasty be elected to rule over them. It's like, no, we're going to set ourselves on fire, thank you very much. And they're like, what? But why? Why would you do that? Because we'd rather be on fire than be shot in the head by you. And with the hope that maybe we're traveling somewhere better further down the line. But it really confuses those that used to hold power over a country when the country changes direction like that.
It confuses, I mean, it was an immensely confusing time for everybody, and there are no clear answers to come out of it. And that's why this, whilst I say I'm trying to colour in these grey zones, that doesn't mean that I've got a beautiful picture to hang up and put on the wall and say it was like this. It's more an attempt to understand some of the mechanisms of how people try to make sense of their lives.
Did you think you would before you started, or in the middle of it, when you were still... was this like a scientific project in a way? Did you have a hypothesis that you sought to prove, and did you then find that you couldn't quite do that, or were you like, I wonder, I have no idea what I'm going to find, and then you did find something?
I spent about a year trying to, find all the bits and bobs of source material that I could and think about what I might find, or how it was as though I had an idea of what I was going to try to cook, but I didn't have the ingredients yet, so I needed to get the ingredients to see how they would affect what this dish was going to be. And a lot of my initial hypotheses were what I found in the archives when I could go in and start collecting the actual joke material. It was enormously shaped, of course, by what I found, and it's hard now to disentangle all the change. But when I look back at the first big notebook where I was like, maybe it's a bit like this, or say one of the main things that I thought was, well, if it's dangerous to share humor at this time, then people are going to be using humor as a kind of exchange of trust. Like if I'm going to make...
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's mostly in the final chapter. Because I didn't find it convincing that this society was atomized, man as wolf to man, this kind of neo-Hobbesian nightmare. Or they have this myth of a boy hero called Pavlik Morozov, trumpeted as like the ultimate Soviet boy hero who denounced his parents for their anti-Soviet activities, and then he was murdered by his family, so a martyr to the Soviet cause. And that he was an ideal, and that people therefore couldn't trust their own kids because the kids would denounce them, this kind of thing. That certainly happened, but it's far from the representative picture, or the most common. I think it was incredibly uncommon for that to happen. Why am I talking about this? So many different directions to go when there's like this much text in the book. So I was talking about, you asked me about trust. That's it.
Yeah, you were talking about the trust tests basically being the jokes being a way to, I guess, see who you could trust. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's really interesting because it's so risky in that kind of like
100%, and that's why it's trust. In this sort of scenario, it's only trust because there's risk.
But then, does that mean that most often the high-risk jokes were told to people you were hoping would be trustworthy? So they wouldn't just say them randomly in the street? You'd tell your uncle or your neighbor and see what would happen?
You have to make careful person-by-person judgments. But part of the problem here that I discovered from looking at several hundred arrest reports was that it was also difficult to be able to take the temperature of the risk you were taking, because some people, a lot of the people in my case study were arrested over a year after they told the joke.
Oh, wow.
Because the regime happily liked to practice retroactive justice. And I think of it kind of like as a sporting analogy. It's as though people were playing a game, and the shots that they'd struck that have flirted with like the boundaries of the court suddenly were rejudged a year or more later as though they'd been played on a much smaller court, and now their shots look way out.
Yeah. And
then they're arrested because of it. So it was very difficult, if not impossible, for people to stay ahead of that curve. But it was, from the source material that I had for a long time, I managed to find this incredible trove of arrest reports. And then there are reports on the mood of the people, which is another like state-created resource. It's pretty funny actually that they had to create these, because after they silenced every outlet for public opinion, they're like, shit, what are the people thinking? We better start compiling reports from workplace informants and from your local committee to neighbors to denouncers and so on. We need to know. So those are one kind of source, but they're kind of the source of trust failing, where mistakes have been made because someone had told a joke and it had ended up getting denounced to the authorities. So personal diaries help take up the slack, and so does this enormous sociological interview project that was done by Harvard University in about 1951, I think. And that was with emigres from the Soviet Union who'd either been displaced at the end of the Second World War or who had fled. And the US Air Force pumps a huge amount of money into this, going, we want to understand what is life like in the Soviet Union. So it's about as close as we could get to an opinion poll for the Soviet period. So it's a little later than the period I'm talking about, but it's incredibly rich and asks people to reflect on like their life stories and asks about jokes in some detail. The source has been ignored for a long time because it was hard to use before it was digitized, and because it was funded by the US Air Force. A lot of social and cultural historians thought this is going to be pure Cold War propaganda. I'm not going to look at this. And that's unfortunate, because it's actually one of the most nuanced and thoughtful studies and sets of analyses of the period that was, I think, decades ahead of its time. And it was largely ignored because of these political reasons, I think. So that allows, because that's not about, telling the police what happened or me looking at the criminal report where they're put away. These are people drawn from across the wide spectrum of different jobs and backgrounds and countries within the USSR, talking about how they could talk to people and make friends, and who they could talk openly with and who they could share jokes jokes with. And loads of them say, yeah, the only way you could tell if you could trust people is if you could share jokes with them. Or I would only share jokes with the people that I trusted, not with anybody else. It was like the litmus test. And it helped to both forge and sustain trust, because it's like you're doing something naughty on the side. It binds you together. So how could you know? Kind of partly what you were asking, how could you know? Tricky to reconstruct, but there's the possibility essentially of you test the waters. You leave a pointed silence. You read out some particularly dramatic report about that seems unrealistic to you about successes, and you just kind of look at each other and go, and you can upgrade from there, and you could start saying popular slogans but at inappropriate times. Like you read some bad news and you're like, thank you, Comrade Stalin. A big slogan at the time.
It's like, thanks, Obama.
Yeah, thanks, Obama. It's exactly the same.
It's the same thing. Yeah.
And you just wheel it back out, and you start flipping it on its head that way. And you can... The way that I thought about this was that it's like being in the mafia, like being mafiosi. Because I read this incredible book by Diego Gambetta, which talks about how criminals communicate. And I thought, okay, it's not that I think people who are telling jokes under the Soviet regime are criminals, but the state thinks they're criminals and is going to dish out repercussions upon them if they say these things. So they've got to learn how to communicate like criminals.
Secret handshakes and whatnot.
Exactly. And say like a kind of secret handshake would be that so there's loads and loads of acronyms throughout the USSR. It's an alphabet soup essentially of contractions and acronyms. It's basically what Orwell was mocking with when he called it newspeak, or it's like tech speak now. It's endless, and so people would decode these things to mean different things. They take so USSR and decode it as the death of Stalin will save Russia. This is, it doesn't make sense in English, but it's the right letters. Or another one, machine tractor station, of which there were many at this time, would be the grave of Comrade Stalin.
Okay.
Or these elite stores called the Taksin, which was a contraction that meant trade with foreigners, and it was like special stores which actually had something on the shelves, could only be accessed by people with privileges, and used hard currency, so not rubles, to be able to get stuff. So they decoded it to say more or less what it actually meant, which there were various versions, but it was like, comrades, wake up, Stalin is destroying the people. Deciphering it letter by letter. And so when you've got this, another popular one was, so hammer and sickle, serpi molet, if you can make it rhyme with hunger and famine, or death and famine, smerti golod. And this got so popular that in one case, in a classroom in Ukraine where the famine hits the hardest, the teacher writes out hammer and sickle, and the whole class chorus, and death and famine at home. I mean, it's so perfect as an example that I don't know if it was a joke in itself, but it seemed as though it was so well known that really could have happened, and kids would often give the game away. And the game they're giving away, which is what I was trying to get to, is you can kind of have a shadow language embedded within the official language. Right. And that could be like a double-bottom suitcase. I say offhand, you're like, yeah, USSR. And everyone's like, what was he saying? USSR? Oh, fine. But I mean, that's the death of Stalin will save Russia.
Once again, I see parallels behind my corporate work stuff. And we started to co-opt the corporate language to joke about the situation. Mm-hmm. And using positive phrases in a negative way or sarcastic way.
Yes. Because then you're taking a language which is being pasted onto your life to say your life is like this and this means this, and it's like having to deal with the tools or, even the oxygen that's surrounding you. And then you're repurposing it. You're seizing control and challenging what those symbols and what those words mean. And you then have this incredible power of the storyteller to shape your interpretation of what these things mean. And that's incredibly psychologically powerful. So George Orwell once said that every joke is a tiny revolution. And I think they're much more important than that. It sounds important, but I think more important, these jokes, those statements, those repurposing of language can be this powerful statement that I joke, therefore I am. I exist, I can think, and I'm not being controlled by this language and this vision that you are trying to impose upon me.
A way to assert your consciousness and cognition over what seems like a nightmare.
Yes. And partly people do this without, it's not that they necessarily quite realize that's why they are doing it, they just feel that they have to. So people, the parallel with children is quite interesting, because children everywhere will like draw graffiti on their desks and on their school books. And sometimes I think that the humor, which can also be just defacing things, but can also be just these sarcastic comments, is the same impulse. I exist. I am not just trapped in this system which is trying to control my movements and what I do. I also have a personality, and I am going to press it into the rock face around me. It's not for nothing that there are graffiti tags back in Pompeii, or that some of the earliest evidence that we have for human existence are handprints and drawings of ourselves on cave walls. We attempt to sign ourselves into existence in the world around us. And in a culture like Stalinism, where your very identity is being prescribed by the state, the impulse to do so was incredibly powerful and important and dangerous too. But people still took the fucking risk. They still felt that they had to do this, because otherwise it's as though your soul and identity is dying.
And yet, you've mentioned to me, and I don't know if it's in your conclusion because I haven't quite gotten to that yet, but you mentioned to me in discussion that once you do that, it's almost like you've then abdicated further action. It's a release of that deep sort of need to have some level of control and express that you exist. Mm-hmm. But then once that's kind of allowed, you don't necessarily then go further with it. In fact, it might make you feel like you've accomplished something and take you away from taking it further. I think you mentioned to me, or Well,
yes and no.
Okay.
Like this is one of the most difficult things that I had to wrestle with in the book, because it actually upsets people that I've spoken to, and I say I don't think that joking is resistance, and I don't think that it really affects like political harm to a ruling authority if that authority can still use direct force, and if you still have to go to work and mouth the words that are expected. I think that it is, I mean, there's several ways to talk about it. One is the laughter and tears thing that I mentioned earlier, which is humor at this time has often been referred to as laughter through tears. And I thought, I don't think so. I think it's laughter instead of tears. And that's not to say that the same people didn't shed tears at different points. You know, let's not get caught, as it's so easy to do, and I do myself still, to talk about, you know, these people did this. They did lots of things. They're people. Some days they're happy, some days they're not. Sometimes they're critical, sometimes they're not. But when they choose to laugh rather than to cry, where do they end up? Some people, and I have a very colourful example in the book of this guy who used humour as part of his kind of dislike of the regime so much. He's constantly going in and out of the Gulag. He's causing trouble when he's there. He's slandering the secret police. He's telling jokes as part of that. He fights the system tooth and nail and refuses to be controlled by them. I mean, insofar as you can, even when you've been put in a camp. So he uses humour for part of that. Other people, I think, use humour to take the path of laughter rather than tears. I think both paths, laughter and tears, actually lead to the same destination, which is acquiescence of some kind, accommodation of yourself to the regime, or accommodating the regime into your life. But it's important which road you take. If you choose despair and tears, that's a horrible route to take. It's despair, it's resignation to the winds of fate, you're completely a victim in this picture. If you take humor, it's like taking the scenic route. It's like you end up at the same destination, but you didn't go down the boring, featureless motorway, or you didn't do it in a packed, stinky bus. You arrived there at least having had a somewhat positive experience, and that shapes very much how you feel about the destination once you reach it. And that's incredibly important. I don't want to suggest that saying, it lets off steam or allows you to feel certain things, but ultimately you go to work the next day and that's bad. No, I think it's good and powerful and important. The tricky thing is that I think that it's very difficult for us to, when we're doing a historical analysis, to not pause and think to our own lives. So you hate the political regime you live under, eh? Okay, so you make some jokes about it. Does that feel good? Yeah, it does. And are you going to try and mount a concerted, organized resistance against that regime? No. No, I think for most people the answer is no. And yet there's sort of implicit expectation as though because it's historical people in the past who always seem to do cool and dramatic things, because that's what we read about, guys, why aren't you doing the thing? They're not doing the thing because they're trying to survive, because they're trying to feed their families, because they're trying to get through the day and get enough sleep, and maybe try and find some more food, and maybe have a chance to reconnect with their spouse who's working different shifts. And so it's not a negative value judgment to say that it doesn't change or challenge the system. It changes immensely how people feel about it. So I think of it as a kind of stoicism. You can't change the world as is confronting you, or it doesn't feel like you can, but you can change how you feel about it, and that really can make a huge difference.
That's quite interesting, especially because, evolutionary speaking, one can make the argument that humor evolved out of suffering, in the sense that I'm not sure if you're aware of this, if you look at the muscular activation of the pattern of which muscles activate in sobbing and laughing, there is no difference. If you play videos of people laughing but take the sound off, most people can't tell if they're crying or laughing.
That is interesting.
So it might be that laughing was an evolutionary step of happy suffering, I guess. That's the only way I can describe it.
Well, it's
to have an emotion, a different emotion, a happy emotion with the suffering instead of a sad one.
I think it's maybe more about the degree of the emotional feeling. So we've all had these experiences where we're so happy we cry, right? And that's, I think, is the physiological crossover is there because it is a release of something that's very powerful and important. One of the main theories of what laughter is that it's a false alarm signal. So something that seems threatening isn't. Laughter is a signal across distance or to other people that actually what seems threatening is benign. And that's how people try and explain, you wouldn't believe the number of academics who've been obsessed with tickling and why we laugh when it's tickling. And we can't tickle ourselves and get the same effect. And one of, I think, the most convincing theories of that is that there's the laughter because it's a play attack. And part of the laughter and the way that we're experiencing it is this sort of discomfort while signaling or experiencing it as benign at the same time. So Freud talked about jokes as a kind of a psychic release, a release of this energy caught up inside us. We build up to the punchline, let it out. We have all these emotional issues, we can try and make a joke about it, let it out. And so there's this pressure release, pressure valve, kind of quite pneumatic system, which I find convincing to an extent. But what I found that didn't do to try and understand people's experience of it is it left out so much of the social world in which this is happening.
This is something I found very, very interesting, because I was expecting a very historical book, which it is, but it's almost more a book about psychology and social psychology. And I found very, very interesting that it seems to me, I'm halfway through the book, that there's a sort of social grooming aspect, almost like a a laughter equivalent of picking ticks out of the other animal's back. You know, like this is a way for people to self-regulate and kind of share an experience. I don't think they would have made the same jokes if they were making them just to themselves.
No, and I think even when people make jokes in their diary, they're doing it to an imagined audience.
Right.
Because joking is, and humour is, for all the thousands of years of people writing about it, there's no clear singular theory. But part of the reason for that is that it's as complex a part of social communication as any other part. And so it is inherently social and human, I think. It is a means of communicating, and it is a means of communicating things which are often important. They're kind of helping and shaping, helping to shape the reality that we're living in. So the more social psychological stuff happens later in the book, where you haven't yet got. So
I felt like you were leading me there, but I haven't.
Thank goodness it feels that way, rather than just like, oh, you know, I'll jump you with this shit later on in the book. So those last two chapters, the first one is about more than resistance. Why I think it's more than resistance, and I mean, I guess it's probably clear to people now that it's pretty complicated to talk about it. And it's not to delegitimize resistance as how joking was dealt with or how people felt that they were doing it. But I think that the humour allows us into this social and psychological world that shows us that so much more is happening beneath the surface. So going back to the mafia aspect, there is an intimacy being expressed where you're both putting yourself on the line. If I tell you a joke, which we know is not, I mean, it'd be like if I told you a racist joke now, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I am racist to do so, but if you laugh, then it shows that we can share a similar perspective, that we can see something from this shared angle and go, that's ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, hopefully I'm telling you a joke which shows that racism is ridiculous, but...
Right. But even when, like, I think we have shared sometimes jokes which are purely racist, and we laughed, and to me it was also it was a trust check, I guess. If I think about it, it was I am safe to make a joke that I wouldn't make with anybody else, not because I have those values, but I can say that to you knowing that you trust in who I am enough that you won't be appalled or reject me for saying this. Yeah. And it's nice to be able to do that, to be able to say something so outrageous that anybody else would probably shun me as a friend.
Yeah.
But you won't, because you know me and you know that I don't mean it.
Exactly, and that sometimes humor is just about like throwing a rock into a pond to see how much of a splash it makes. It can just be a celebration of breaking a taboo, of doing something dramatic, but then to share it with somebody creates this intimacy that you're describing, because you can't both find something funny unless you are sharing some things in common. This is partly why so many jokes are lost in translation between different cultures. So you're like, ha ha ha, don't you see? Oh yeah, I need to catch you up on 10 years of like meme history or cat jokes or something for you to get what this is about. So it's like I give you a token of trust. I tell the joke. You give me like an exchange, like I bought you a pint and you buy me one back because you laugh at the joke. And then we feel this sense of connection in the process. This helps create and sustain trust because it's in an environment where what we just passed between each other was contraband. And it is, when talking about the mafia, the guy I mentioned earlier, Gambetta, said there are advantages to opening your closet to show people the skeletons inside. Because if we're two mafiosi and we don't trust each other, then how do I know that we can do anything together? Well, if I tell you some dirt on me, I'm going to give you some compromising material, then you know I'm not going to betray you because you've got something over me. And then if you give me something in return, then we're bound together knowing that we've put something of ourselves on the line. And that is what's happening if you're sharing this contraband joke material too. So I like to mix my metaphors with this and say that if, the intimacy part is essentially you tell the joke and you realize that we're both in the same boat, it's also to commit yourselves both to going down with the ship. Ba-boom.
Very nice.
I'm proud of that.
So going back to something that came up for me during that last bit you were talking about is the fact that how do you know it's a joke is a real problem in terms of looking at historical jokes that were told a long time ago. But you told me that you knew because the people that wrote down were like, this was hilarious, I laughed my ass off. So they were noting down the fact that thought they were funny jokes.
Well, they didn't say they thought it was hilarious.
Okay.
And these NKVD operatives, the secret police people, would write like, this was said with irony. Or
okay.
This, they shared an anecdote, which is roughly English joke, usually of a more political character, so that they know they are recognizing the fact that these are attempts at humor. It's not like the regime is so like po-faced that it can't acknowledge that these are attempts at humor. It's just that the regime thinks this is completely fucking unacceptable.
Okay.
The regime has got a weird relationship with humor in general, because it's not a regime in which there's to be no laughter at all. They have satirical magazines, but only aiming things against things they don't like. There are musical comedies. There are comedic stories that are printed in the mainstream newspapers. But the Bolsheviks are really worried by humor because they feel like satire was something that helped them get to power in the first place. And they then feel like it's as though you won this war and got to power, and then you put your rifle up above the mantelpiece and it's just sitting there. And they're like, I think other people could grab that rifle and can probably shoot us with it. Maybe we shouldn't have the rifle there. So there's a serious discussion, like ridiculously serious discussion, that happens in the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s. They're like, okay, in this wonderful socialist world that we've now got and our enemies have been defeated, we don't need satire and humor. It's a weapon, clearly, and we don't have any more enemies, so maybe we should just get rid of it. And this is something they really worry about. So they do the most Soviet thing in the world, which is to form a commission to investigate the role of humor and satire throughout Western European heritage and history and decide whether or not they need to effectively ban humor. And they decide in the end that, okay, it can be used as a tool or weapon in the hands of a particular group, say class, from their perspective. But given that the regime still has some of its own enemies, the external world powers and so forth, and it's a very useful tool, it should be used to kill with laughter if it's the enemies and correct with laughter the friends of the regime. So it can be used as a nice little corrective. That's not really how it ends up being used so much. But then that's partly why the party card holding people that I mentioned earlier, it's as though they were trying to use that doctrine, what was officially said would be a good idea, to correct with laughter the failings of the regime.
Yeah. And instead they were sent to the gulags.
Yeah, because, I mean, I think this point can sound flippant, but I have trouble completely dismissing it, is that the really serious revolutionary type people who do end up taking up arms and overthrowing a regime usually don't have a very good sense of humor. No. They're the ones who don't use the kind of humor which is let me just deal with and cope and adapt to this, but are like, you suck, ha ha ha, and now I'm going to try and seize power. And like Lenin and Stalin and his entourage, they've got crap sense of humor. They're just mocking each other and using humor as you can as this kind of tool of hierarchical power assertion. And that's not at all the kind of humor which I see played out amongst the majority of the people living under them. So it's more like it's as though if you're in this little enclave of Stalin and his fellow leaders, where there's a culture where humor is used one way, or we could imagine like a culture in any given workplace that has certain perspectives, that then if you hear about it happening outside, you're like,
they're projecting why they would use it as to why the people are using it.
Precisely. Summed it up better than I was going to. They're just projecting outward. But then that ignores all of the reasons that the individual people might have to tell particular jokes. So I think of it, I feel like I'm always drawn back to dancing around the resistance question because it seems to just antagonize so many people. But one of the other ways that I think helps get across what I'm trying to say is to draw a parallel with black markets. Say, black markets exist because of the shortfalls of the white markets. Black markets don't exist to try and overthrow the white market or like destroy it. Black markets exist in this kind of symbiotic way. They're a compensatory mechanism which helps the official world work. And I think jokes are the equivalent at a psychological level. They're a compensatory mechanism which ultimately enables the mainstream version to work. Like the oil in the machinery, the unofficial stuff which appears to contradict and suggest that the official world shouldn't or couldn't work or they're opposed to it. But what it actually does is help people find a way to prop up this creaking edifice that they're forced to live in.
Cool. Were you surprised as you finished or completed the book by anything? Something that you didn't think you'd end up believing or finding? Or are there any surprises, I guess?
Surprised I finished it.
It did take you a while. Although I would say that since I met you, the 2 years that it, 2.5 years that it took for it to be fully completed and released, a lot of it was due to your challenges with the traditional academic publishing system.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask you a few questions about that. Maybe we can start there as well. You told me that the traditional route for someone writing a book like this is to go somewhere like the Oxford University Press, for example, because it's prestigious. It's generally where these types of books are bought from, but that they have a tendency of publishing for the prestige rather than to actually sell any copies or have anyone read them. So they end up pricing a book like this at 60 to 80 pounds?
Yeah, at least like £65 plus.
And you really wanted this book to be read?
Well, I wanted it to be... I wanted, because I'd met so many people when I told them about the book and the subject and so on. They were like, oh, I'd like to read that. And part of me died inside knowing that they would never get to. I wanted it to be possible for people to read if they want to. And so to be told that the system is essentially, you need to get published by a good academic publisher because of the prestige value. And if you want an academic career, hiring committees look at this stuff and they judge you in a very hierarchical way based on, do you have a prestigious publisher like Princeton or Oxford or Harvard or stuff like that. And then they'll be dismissive without actually looking at the content of your book if it doesn't have that nice little stamp of authority on it. And yet, so I had an offer on the table from Oxford University Press to publish my book, and I spoke to one of the editors there, and she essentially laid out the situation where they consider it a success, the limit of their aspirations, if the book sells 300 copies in its lifetime. In hardcover, so at about £70. And I said, okay, so I understand that this is the model you have in mind, but wouldn't it be true to say that this is based on the idea that it won't sell many copies, so you need to price it high to make it profitable? They're like, yes. I said, is it possible that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, that if it is priced that high, only university libraries are going to be able to afford it? Like, yes, that's true. Do you think these things might be connected? No.
There's a meme I'm going to show you.
It's unfortunate because people will off the record admit that it doesn't make sense and yet agree to continue perpetuating the system. I mean, it's quite Soviet in that way. The same way that I've spoken to colleagues who will say academic hiring committees, it's a total lottery, it's really unfair on the applicant because your application could be thrown out just because of a personal prejudice. And then in the same conversation tell a story where they are on a hiring panel and do precisely that. Like they throw out someone's application. Like they like to complain. I mean, we can all be guilty of this. We complain about something whilst we ourselves prop up the system. Anyway, I don't want to go too far down the rant. But when it came to the publishing situation, there was no model in place that they would agree to or talk about. Where I said, so how many copies would I need to sell for you to put out a paperback at a cheaper price? Like, oh, we don't commit to things like that. I was like, so there is not even a model. There's not even a hope. There's not a target. There's nothing. If I work my ass off to go onto the radio, onto the TV, write pieces, put it out there, there's not actually a model anywhere, where if I do X, Y, Z, you will do this thing and make it affordable. No. So for me at that time, that was very distressing, and it's a scarcity mindset in the academic world, that you would be a fool to turn down a publication offer from the likes of Oxford University Press. And that was personally very difficult for me to want to, do the thing that everybody says is stupid. But I did.
You
turn
did.
them down.
You had a great session with Philip McKernan that made you finally sort of decide to commit to this path. And then I guess it's been, since properly trying to have that done, it's only been about 3 months.
Something like that. We just did it.
Okay, so 3 months to self-publish, and it wasn't without challenges, but you've
plenty of practical challenges. And in the process of doing this and some word getting out, another academic publisher approached me and said, we would like to publish this thing. We'll give it the attention that it needs. It will appear on the tables on the front, the front of store for bookshops. And that was, I felt like the devil was coming to me with, you've committed to doing the thing the way you wanted to do it, but how about this? And I'm not against there being like a second edition of the book in future published by someone where a good situation could be agreed between the two of us. But at that point, it's like, no, I don't believe you, because I've never seen any of your books on the front table of a bookshop anywhere, So I can't trust that, and I didn't want to enter into laborious contract negotiations, which almost nobody does. You just, oh, thank you so much for publishing my book. Oh, I'm so grateful. Yes, I sign away all the rights. Many of them actually ask you to sign away the rights, so you don't even own your book anymore. That's their attitude. Publishers today, perhaps I don't know so much about the world of fiction publishing. They give the same. First of all, they don't give good advances to those promoting a product to give them the space to write and complete the stuff. They don't invest in you as an author, which they used to do, where they would think there's something in this guy, maybe 3 books down the line, there'll be a winner. We're going to invest in him or her. And so they won't do that. They used to do like nice marketing stuff, try and get ads out, hook you up with interviews, try and really get the word out and promote you and so forth. They rarely do that unless you're J.K. Rowling or something, or like a big established writer already. And yet they still take the maximum cut that they always have done, whilst telling you, why haven't you built your social media following? Why haven't you booked yourself into interviews? Why haven't you put out adverts and got yourself out into the world and done it? They're still taking, I forget the numbers, you could listen to Chris Ryan talk about this, where he's had a big bestseller, a New York Times bestseller book. And he gets some ridiculous amount, like a 3% royalty on a paperback sale or less. And where's the rest of it going? To the publisher. They get all of that, and what do they actually do? Distribution? Well, if you want to publish through Amazon, as I've done, Amazon have got the best distribution system in the world. Do they do copy editing and make it look nice for you? No, they outsource it to India, to where people whose native language is not English will deal with it. Many of them do an incredible job, to be fair, but it's not like you're getting editorial input from somebody who's kind of helping to craft and guide your ideas. It's just like, no, go and fix the typos, please. to these people working for very low wages. And do they give you any guidance? No. Will they get it reviewed anywhere? No. So what do they do? I think modern publishers, I didn't intend to go on such a rant, but it's been deeply personal to me because I had dreamed for most of my life of wanting to have my book published and out there, like by a publisher and see it in bookshops. That's one of the things that I've wanted most in my life. And so it feels quite painful to have that kind of dream turn to dust a bit, or to feel like, oh no, am I the jaded one, or is everything else jaded in this industry? What they do now is essentially sell boxes, which is the packaging of the book. They want the content creators to give them the thing essentially for free. Maybe they'll give you a few £100, but basically for free, say 10 years of your life and work. They want that. They will put it in a box, they put a cover on it, and then they will list it on a catalogue. Click. That's what they do. They'll try and put up some nice extra roadblocks for you by getting like anonymous peer reviewers, and they'll then follow the views of people who may be positive, may be negative, and so on. And it's just a series of obstacles you can jump through. But is that quality control? No, because I've heard dozens and dozens of stories where, you just takes one asshole peer reviewer and your brilliant work won't see the light of day. And it's not as though that there aren't shit books in publication. It's not. So that's how it turned out. So what I wanted was, once I could get over the sort of loss of that dream, I guess, was I realized, so the one thing that I wouldn't be getting from the professional publishing world was the prestige aspect, and the fact that it will automatically end up in like libraries and so forth, and the fact that there may be plenty of prejudice I will face where like mainstream reviewers wouldn't want to review a self-published book, because self-publishing continues, it's changing, but it continues to have this stigma of being vanity publishing, as though you were too shit to actually get published, so you had to do it yourself. Well, newsflash people, Charles Dickens self-published. Jane Austen self-published. Marcel Proust self-published. It's not that one equals the other, that self-publishing equals you're bad. And it's not that self-publishing equals you're good either. I'm not saying that because I self-publish too, I'm like Proust. I'm just saying.
By the same token, though, being published by a prestigious publisher doesn't mean it's any good.
No,
based on what you've told me.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know how that's going to affect this book. All I know is that I had to get it out so I could try and move on from it, so I could finalize it, nail it down, and it be a book. And I got in touch with some of the most senior and respected people in the field of Soviet and Russian history, and said, could you take a look at the manuscript, and if you feel like it's something that you would be happy to write a few words about, that would be great. And they all said yes. And so I got all these review comments from these people on the book that I hope will try and avoid this sort of stigma of like, I didn't write it in 10 minutes and print it in my garage.
No. It's very well thought of, both in its content, the graphics of the outside, the typesettings had a lot of thought and time put into it. It's a piece of work. It's a piece of art. That's what I was trying to say.
You're a piece of work.
Yeah, I got mixed up. What is your hope for this book?
What I hope for people who read it is to find a way to recognize themselves in these situations that seem so extreme to us. So this is like the more positive version of the kind of thing that Jordan Peterson talks about, where Peterson likes to encourage us to have our minds blown by looking back at the Nazi period and making us recognize that we have it in us all to have been a concentration camp guard. That we all have that seed. Like, don't pretend that we would have been so high and mighty that we wouldn't have gone along with the Nazi regime. I mean, okay, it's not that I disagree with that as a principle, but I think we could also take this view, a different view, which is to look back and go, look how much I have in common with these people who were living under a regime like that. Look how this is a deeply human story, and it would serve us well to recognize that the kinds of means of getting by and trying to make their life make sense, even in the most contradictory and dire circumstances, under peril of arrest, under threat of execution, it's familiar to how we cope with things now. Telling jokes with our friends, pushing back at our corporate jobs, but ultimately still finding a way to make a life that makes sense, to push back enough that we feel that we exist as a critical mind, that we exist with people that we trust who think like us. But here's the warning there. If we do that all the time in our daily lives, then we delude ourselves if we think that that's enough to stop terrible, oppressive regimes and systems arising. It's not. We're already doing a very human thing, so it's not like I'm saying this is, we're fools or whatever, but we need an awareness that we are capable, that human beings are incredibly adaptable. We are capable of adapting to just about anything. And that has been to our best advantage in so many ways throughout our evolution. That's why we're still here. That's why we're still seemingly the dominant species on this planet. Great. But adapting to things which are really in the long term terrible for us is not a good thing to adapt to. And unless we recognize that we are adapting, unless we recognize that the time for jokes is when we are trying to cope with and adapt to, instead of stand against, fight off, and refuse, we can land ourselves in some really terrible situations. Laughing about things can certainly help us survive, can draw us closer to people that we care about, can be pivotal in our mental health, our emotional health, and our social health. I'm not saying don't laugh. I'm not saying don't make fun of things. But I am saying we need to detect, we need to find a line in ourselves as to where the joking stops. And that's a difficult line to draw. But don't delude ourselves, don't delude yourself that because you make fun of your boss that he isn't in charge of you.
No.
Don't delude yourself that just because you don't take something seriously, like your job, or say, oh yeah, all politicians are crooks, ha ha ha. Well, okay, I say that sometimes, I think that, but I'm not telling myself that means that I'm being politically effective in any way. Apathy is not effective.
No.
So it's not like a call to arms. I hope that it's more that it can cultivate a sense that these lessons from history that we hear so much about are more subtle than we think. There's a similar problem with the Nazi regime in that we don't take it seriously when people say this is what happened under Hitler, because people say that all the time. But sometimes it's true. But we don't really believe, I don't think that any of us really believe, and apart from those who are still alive who lived through it, we don't believe that such things can happen again. Well, guess what? The people who lived under it also didn't believe it was going to happen, and then it did.
Yeah.
We don't believe dramatic change is going to happen. We don't believe that the norms that we're used to are going to change until they do. And so it's not to then live in fear of it, but to live with our eyes open, and to not think that we're somehow inherently safe, or somehow inherently smarter and better equipped to deal with things than the people who lived, fewer than 100 years in the past. Motherfucker.
Boom, mic drop.
Mic drop.
Can't drop the mic, it's on a boom.
What do you think? Did that make sense? Does it sound
for
like...
Sure. I haven't finished the book yet. I'm finding it super interesting. It's telling me a lot about Soviet history that I didn't know. It's telling me a lot about the social aspect of humor, coping mechanisms in people. Like I'm finding it a very powerful journey and something that is enriching my mind. So I'm very grateful that you've spent 10 years of your life writing it.
And this is what it was all for.
Yeah, for me to take advantage of. No, but seriously, I think it's a book everyone should read, regardless of which part of it they're interested in, because whether they like history or not, the psychology aspect or the humor aspect, there is something to make you pause and go, huh, for everyone, I think.
I hope so. So I mean, that's what drew me to this in the first place. I'm not generically obsessed with history. I'm not unspecifically interested in Stalinism. What I am interested is in people and how we make sense of our lives and how we tell stories to ourselves about why our lives are the way they are, how we come to accept things even if we don't like them, how we always find a way to make friends and connections with people, and how we will try and open up and show our secret selves with other people. We have that drive to do so. And I do find that this is, for all that I may have just sounded more like striking a cautionary or negative tone, I mean, that's more a recognize yourself in the past so that you're not going to delude yourself in the present. So I hope it's a positive. But you asked me what surprised me most in the book. Maybe it's not a surprise, but it's something that really feels good to have found, is that I've talked to you about this before, but so there's this, in the sociological literature, there's a belief that when there's times of catastrophe, when there is a breakdown, be it like a massive flood, an earthquake, power is lost, that kind of thing, or plane crash in a populated area, that everyone will go feral. The shops will get looted, people will turn on each other. We'll see, I mean, this is why zombie films are so compelling, or post-apocalyptic films, that we just think everyone goes feral, turns on each other, and that's somehow our real underlying human nature, and it's terrifying. The veneer of civilization is incredibly thin. What the deep sociological literature shows, there's a great book called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit that I use. It sparked a lot of thoughts for this book. That essentially the opposite is true. Some people will indeed loot shops. Some people will indeed be dicks. The majority of people who live through these times look back on them as some of the happiest times in their life, even though they were hard, even though loved ones of theirs died. Why? Because people came together as a community to help each other. They set up soup kitchens. Those who have something give something to others who don't. They set up shelters. People find that they have a sense of purpose and mission to help rebuild, to help save people, to help other people survive. And this incredible sense of community arises in that situation, which people then feel strongly enough about that they almost are sad when the power comes back on. And I thought this echoed so clearly to me with the view that is long held, or we continue to reflexively turn to, about the Stalinist period. It was filled with terror. Nobody could trust anybody else. Everybody denounced everybody else. A horribly atomized, distrustful society that we could barely call a society at all. What actually happened, from what I've picked out here, from what I think, from all the evidence that I've seen, is that people continue to have this drive to help each other. That doesn't mean indiscriminately. That means they find the people that they trust already. They have their friends, their family, and then just like anybody would, there's this person, I vouch for them, or this guy can share a joke. Okay, I'm kind of down with him. They help each other out. A lot of the black market was essentially getting things through a friend of a friend to make life bearable. Instead of what was thought of this spiraling idea that this idea of like spiraling arrests, that if you didn't denounce someone before they denounced you, then you'd be questioned why you didn't do any denouncing and this kind of thing. What actually happens when somebody gets arrested from a family, more often than not, is that the family draws closer together to support each other. And even the state recognizes it because they know that the family will come along and queue to try and send packages to their loved ones. If the state totally believed its own version of events, that therefore they're showing sympathy with an enemy of the people, the family should have been locked up for just standing in the queue. But even the state recognizes this is a basic human mechanism. And they're like, fuck off, essentially, send them home. I thought it would be useful to treat this period as a state of sustained emergency and to consider it through that sociological lens. That in these conditions, the hardest conditions, people do find ways of finding bonds between each other, not just for utilitarian ends, but because those connections with other people give us meaning and joy, a sense of connection, a sense that our lives actually have some sort of significance. And it's funny to me that by saying that sort of thing, it's like a challenge to the existing picture of this period, of this decade, or Stalinism more generally, to essentially say there is a human story to this which we can recognize. But we have this tendency to look through these distorting lenses. So that sociological thing that I mentioned, that it shows people form these communities in these states of disaster. Governments don't listen to that research. It's all there. The sociological research has been done. But there's a fear. The fear comes first that it will turn into a zombie film. Our expectation of how people will react under the intense stress and pressure remains one of fear, even though the experience as it plays out contradicts it. It's like we won't do the maths and put the pieces together.
Well, governments seem to very rarely follow any of those types of reports. Like we have the example of the drug report that they commission, thinking that drugs are making society so bad that we need to be even more strict with them. The report came back and said, actually, drugs are not that bad. We should legalize them. And the government's like, no.
It becomes political that way. So what I hope then, in part of a book about a very dark time, is not to just have, here's a bunch of jokes of people laughing in the dark, whistling to themselves, pretending it's all okay, but to show a really human picture of how they made extraordinary times ordinary in the sense of making them understandable, how they could try and get a grip on it. How there is an optimistic story here to see about how people don't just rampantly all turn on each other and destroy bonds between each other, that they find a way to cope and to adapt and to live and to feel like their life has some sort of meaning. And some of that is self-delusion, but most of our meaning maps that we layer onto the world are delusion of one sort or another. We tell ourselves a story because it's the story we want to hear, but it's cool that there is a story that wasn't just one of torture, repression, and destruction.
All right. Where can people find your book if they want to buy it?
People can find the book on Amazon, all the Amazon sites around the world. It's called It's Only a Joke, Comrade. Humour, Trust in Everyday Life Under Stalin. It's like $20 or £14.99 or $16.99 in euros. Which is definitely a lot less than 60 to 80 pounds. And I would love it if you would check that out. There will be an ebook coming soon. We just need to sort out the formatting of it, and I want to record an audio book as well.
And I believe if they wish, they can go to any bookstore and order it through them, which might help the book become more popular in the system.
Yeah, if you can do that, that would be pretty awesome and cool. It should by now have filtered through to bookstores' ordering systems, meaning that you go into your local Barnes and Noble or your Waterstones or whatever and say, I would like this book. Can I order it? You'll get it at the retail price. And then it kind of flags up gradually to these bookshops that this is a thing that might be worth having in stock. So that would be really cool if you want to support your local bookshop as well as checking out the book.
Amazing. And we are going to do a little competition for people to win a copy.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys want a copy, you can head over to the website voicesofthedark.world. Find this interview there, and in the text there we will have a button to tweet out or Instagram out the hashtag for the book. All you have to do is follow through with that, and you'll be in the running.
Yeah, tweet it out with the hashtag there. We'll review them all, and maybe we'll get a giant lottery ball hand turning.
Oh, that'll be fun.
That'll be cool. Well, then we'd have to buy one, so maybe not. And then you can choose who you want it signed to, or if you don't want it signed at all, however you want it, and we will mail that out to you.
Awesome. Thank you once again for your labor and for coming on the show as a guest.
Thank you for having me. I hope people will find something interesting in the book. If you've got more questions about it, then hit us up on the social medias. You can find the show notes at voicesinthedark.world to get all the links. And that's it.
Yeah, and if you find yourself in an oppressive regime, please remember to be silly, be kind, and be weird.